Each encounter holds a hidden truth. Every investigation demands clarity. Empowering your legal rights, uncovering pure justice.
Hey, don't move. Hands where I can see them. Let's see some papers right now.
Morning, I'm just getting back to my car.
Papers, now. Don't make this harder.
I'm a law enforcement officer. I'm going to reach into my pocket and pull out my credentials. Both hands nice
My
and slow.
pocket, coming out now.
Special Agent Gabriel Torres, Los Angeles County Sheriff.
ICE agent Marcus Diaz arrived that morning with the kind of confidence that comes from never being questioned. He spotted the man outside the store, and without a single word of greeting, he moved in fast, blocked his path, and told him he wasn't going anywhere. He got in his face, demanded papers, and made it very clear that resisting would end badly. What he didn't know was that the man standing in front of him had spent over 2 decades training the very officers who would one day sign off on his termination papers. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. It was a regular Saturday morning in Southern California, the kind of morning where the sun comes up early, the streets are quiet, and most people are just trying to get through their errands and get back home. No drama, no tension, just a normal day. At least that's what Victor Ramos thought when he pulled it into the parking lot of his local grocery store and stepped out of his car. Victor Ramos was 44 years old, and he had given more than half his life to law enforcement. He wasn't just a police officer. He was a training academy instructor, the kind of man that departments relied on to shape new recruits and turn them into professionals. He had spent over 2 decades inside classrooms and on training grounds, teaching cadets how to handle pressure, how to de-escalate situations, how to treat people with dignity regardless of where they came from. He knew the law not just as a set of rules, but as something he lived and breathed every single day. On this particular morning, though, none of that was on his mind. He was off duty, dressed in regular clothes, carrying nothing but his keys and his phone. Just a man trying to buy groceries like everybody else in that parking lot. He had just stepped away from his car when he noticed the figure moving toward him with purpose. It wasn't a casual walk. It was the kind of deliberate stride that law enforcement officers recognize immediately. Steady, locked in, with the body language of someone who has already made a decision before saying a single word. Victor noticed it right away, because he had walked that same walk himself hundreds of times over his career. Marcus Diaz was an ICE agent who had been working immigration enforcement in the region for several years. He was known among his colleagues as aggressive and action-oriented, someone who prided himself on quick pickups and clean numbers. To him, the job was about efficiency. You spotted someone who fit a certain profile. You moved on them fast, and you sorted out the details later. On that Saturday morning, he had been running routine operations in the area when Victor Ramos caught his attention. He didn't know Victor's name. He didn't know his rank or his record or his career. What he saw was a Latino man, alone in a parking lot. And in his mind, that was enough to act on. Diaz closed the distance between them quickly, positioning his body to cut off any exit before Victor even had a chance to register what was happening. He didn't introduce himself calmly. He didn't ask a polite opening question. He stepped directly into Victor's space and told him to stop moving. His hand went up, his voice carried authority, and the message was immediate. "You are not free to walk away from me right now." Victor stopped, not out of fear, but out of the trained instinct of a man who understood exactly how these situations worked. He kept his hands visible, his posture steady, and his voice even. He asked Diaz what the problem was. Diaz didn't answer the question. Instead, he told Victor he needed to see identification and proof of status, his tone making it clear he wasn't asking. People in that parking lot were starting to notice. A woman pushing a cart slowed down. A man loading bags into his trunk looked over. Nobody stepped in, but everyone was watching. And Victor Ramos, a man who had spent his entire career standing on the other side of exactly this kind of moment, now found himself standing in the middle of it, in his own neighborhood, on his day off, being treated like a suspect for no reason other than the way he looked. The injustice of it hadn't fully landed yet, but it was coming. Victor Ramos had been in enough tense situations throughout his career to know when something was about to get worse. This was one of those moments. Diaz wasn't slowing down. He was leaning in, and the small crowd forming around them in that parking lot was about to witness something that no amount of training could have fully prepared Victor for. Not because he didn't know how to handle pressure, but because he had never had to handle it like this. As the target, Victor stayed calm. He told Diaz clearly and directly that he was a police officer. He said it without aggression, without panic. The same measured tone he had taught cadets to use when a situation needed to be brought down, not pushed up. He even reached slowly toward his pocket to show his credentials, making every movement visible and deliberate, the way he had instructed hundreds of students to do over the years. For a moment, it seemed like that might be enough. Like Diaz would pause, look at the badge, and let the whole thing dissolve right there in the parking lot. That's not what happened. Diaz looked at the identification. Then he looked back at Victor, and instead of standing down, he told Victor that the credentials needed to be verified, that he wasn't going anywhere until that process was complete. His tone hadn't changed. His posture hadn't softened. In fact, if anything, he seemed more locked in than before, as if the badge had complicated things for him rather than resolved them. And his response to that complication was to dig deeper into his position instead of stepping back from it. This is the moment that defines how powers can go wrong. Not always in the first move, but in the refusal to correct course when the facts are standing right in front of you. Victor kept his composure, but inside, something was shifting. He understood exactly what was happening. He had seen bias operate in real time before, had studied it, discussed it in classrooms, warned young cadets about it, but understanding something intellectually and standing inside it on a Saturday morning in your own neighborhood are two completely different experiences. He asked Diaz again, calmly, to explain the legal basis for the detention. It was a precise question, the kind a trained officer asks, the kind that reveals immediately whether the person across from you knows what they're doing or is just operating on instinct and assumption. Diaz didn't give a clean answer. He deflected, repeated his demand for verification, and called for his partner to come over. His partner arrived within seconds, and now there were two federal agents standing in front of Victor Ramos in a public parking lot, treating a 44-year-old law enforcement instructor like a man with something to hide. The humiliation of that moment was not small. Victor was in his own community. People around him knew him. Neighbors, familiar faces, people who had seen him in uniform, people whose kids he may have coached, or whose family members had gone through the academy. Now they were watching him get hemmed in by federal agents who had decided what he was before he ever opened his mouth. Every second that passed made the scene more visible, more public, and more damaging. But Victor didn't raise his voice. He didn't make any sudden movements. He stood exactly the way he had taught others to stand, grounded, composed, and fully present. Because he knew, with the clarity that comes from decades of experience, that his behavior in this moment mattered, not just for his own safety, but for what came after it. What Diaz hadn't accounted for was that Victor wasn't just remembering what was happening. He was documenting it in his mind, with the precision of a man who knew exactly how investigations work, exactly what details matter in a courtroom, and exactly what a pattern of conduct looks like when it's laid out in front of a judge. Every word Diaz said, every action he took, Every second of that unlawful detention was being catalogued by the one person in that parking lot most qualified to understand its full legal weight. Diaz kept pushing. He told Victor the process would take as long as it needed to take. He said it like a man who had never once had to answer for how long he made someone wait, or why, or on what grounds. That comfort, that ease of assumption, was about to run out completely. The verification came back, and when it did, the entire energy in that parking lot shifted in an instant. Whatever Diaz had been expecting to see on that screen, it was not what appeared. Victor Ramos was not an undocumented migrant. He was not a man with something to hide. He was a credentialed, active law enforcement officer with over 2 decades of service. A man who held an official position training police cadets at an academy, the kind of institution that exists to produce the very people Diaz worked alongside every single day. The badge was real. The credentials were real. All of it was exactly what Victor had said it was from the very first moment Diaz stepped into his path. Diaz went quiet. His partner went quiet. The confidence that had carried both of them through the entire confrontation didn't fade gradually. It collapsed. There was no smooth recovery, no professional pivot, no clean way to walk back what had just happened in front of witnesses in a public parking lot on a Saturday morning. Victor looked at him and said nothing for a moment. He didn't need to. The silence did more than any words could have. What this moment exposed went far beyond one agent's mistake. It revealed something systemic. The assumption that a Latino man in casual clothes in a parking lot in his own neighborhood was a problem that needed to be solved before a single fact was confirmed. Diaz had built his entire approach that morning on a foundation of bias. And when that foundation gave way, there was nothing underneath it. Victor had known men like Diaz his entire career. He had warned cadets about becoming men like Diaz. He had stood in front of classrooms and explained in plain language exactly how assumption becomes action, and action becomes injustice. And now he had lived it himself, in full, with witnesses. He picked up his keys, he straightened his jacket, and he walked toward his car with the same steady calm he had carried through every second of that confrontation, because he had already decided, before Diaz ever said another word, that this moment was not going to end in that parking lot. It was going to end in a courtroom. Victor Ramos didn't go home that day and let it go. He sat down, documented everything while it was fresh, and contacted legal representation within days of the incident. He wasn't driven by anger. He was driven by something much more focused than that. He had spent his entire career teaching young officers that accountability was not optional, that the badge came with responsibility, and that no one in law enforcement was above the standards they swore to uphold. Now, he was going to prove he believed every word of it. The lawsuit was filed against the federal government, and what came out during the legal process was damaging. Victor's legal team laid out the confrontation in precise detail. The lack of legal basis for the stop, the refusal to stand down after credentials were presented, the public nature of the humiliation, and the undeniable fact that the only thing that triggered Diaz's actions that morning was the color of Victor's skin. There was no other explanation, no other factor, nothing except assumption dressed up as procedure. The federal government fought it, but the evidence was clear. The witnesses were real. And Victor Ramos was not the kind of man who could be dismissed or discredited on a stand. He was composed, credible, and precise, exactly the kind of witness that wins cases. The jury awarded him $12.9 million. It was one of the largest verdicts of its kind, and it sent a message that traveled far beyond that courtroom. It told every federal agency operating on bias that there is a cost. It told every Latino officer Every minority professional, every person who has ever been reduced to a stereotype in a parking lot, that their dignity has value. Legal, documented, quantifiable value. Victor spoke after the verdict with the same calm he had carried through everything. He said the money was never the point. The point was that what happened to him happens to people every single day who don't have a badge, don't have legal resources, and don't have 2 decades of credibility to fall back on. He wanted this case to be the one that people pointed to. Proof that silence was never the answer. Marcus Diaz had walked into that parking lot, certain he had power. Victor Ramos walked out of that courtroom, having redefined what power actually looks like. Marcus Diaz had walked into that parking lot, certain he had power. Victor Ramos walked out of that courtroom, having redefined what power actually looks like.
Fairness is an enduring mission, and insight serves as your safeguard. Thank you for watching and advocating for absolute clarity.